A millionaire reunites with his mother after 30 years. The screech of brakes tearing into the pavement cut through the morning like a scream. Mrs. Aurelia dropped to her knees in the middle of the crosswalk, her bags of produce spilling everywhere. A carrot rolled onto the curb, a bunch of collard greens got flattened under a tire. The horn was still blaring when the driver climbed out of his car, a shiny new black SUV that looked straight off a dealership lot. "Are you out of your mind?" the young man shouted, pointing at his bumper, barely scratched. "You almost wrecked my car!" Mrs. Aurelia didn't answer. She tried to get up slowly, her knees shaking, her hands braced against the grimy asphalt. A plastic sack split open, sending tomatoes bouncing like marbles. She didn't cry, she didn't complain. She just stared at the produce on the ground with a weariness that went deeper than her bones. It was the exhaustion of someone who'd been forgotten too many times. The guy, still huffing, took a step back, and then he saw. Her hands were trembling. She was out of breath. She was reaching for a bunch of scallions, but could barely close her fingers around them. Her hunched shoulders looked as fragile as glass, yet she was still trying to save the veggies, as if each leaf were a lifeline. His expression softened. The anger drained away. Silence stretched between them. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" She shook her head, stayed on the ground, gathering crushed collard leaves with a dignity that stabbed him in the heart. He crouched down, picked up one of the tomatoes, still intact, and handed it to her. That's when he noticed a thin silver bracelet on her wrist with a tiny engraving. He blinked. Was he just imagining it? It was identical to the one he'd kept since he was a kid. Mrs. Aurelia raised her eyes, wary, and then she froze. She looked at his hand, a faint scar at the base of his index finger, the same one her son had. She stopped breathing for a moment. He saw it too, but neither spoke. "I'll help you, okay?" he said softly. She nodded, and together they gathered the rest in silence. Minutes later, she straightened her bag and walked off. She muttered thanks without meeting his eyes. He stood there, watching her silhouette vanish around the corner. Slow steps, one leg dragging. The image etched itself in his mind like an old photograph. Later, he returned to that same street. He needed to understand why he couldn't stop thinking about her. He trailed her from a distance, creeping along until he saw her slip into a modest little house with peeling plaster and a clothesline in the window. He stayed in his car, not sure why he was even there. Mrs. Aurelia went inside, set her bag on the table, pulled a handful of coins from her pocket, and spread them out on a cloth. She counted them, then counted again. She picked up an empty pill bottle, stared at it in silence. She couldn't afford a refill. She opened a drawer and took out a small box with a fabric lid. Inside lay a faded photo of a smiling boy, and next to it, a bracelet exactly like hers, its match. She lifted it carefully, closed her eyes, and cried. Across the street, Joshua watched, not fully understanding why, but he felt something in his chest he couldn't name. He just knew he needed answers. Joshua couldn't think about anything else since the day before. The image of the old woman on the ground, that bracelet on her wrist, and the way she stared at his scar, all of it replayed in his mind like a movie without an ending. He went back to the market, waited for hours until he saw her again, carrying that same bag of wilted produce. She walked slowly, each step seeming to cost her. He approached her, tried to start a conversation. He didn't know what to say, but he needed to see for himself, to confirm what he felt. Little by little, she began to speak. She kept it simple, no melodrama. She said she'd had a son. He'd gone missing in a fire when he was only 3. Since that day, all she had left was a silver bracelet, the match to one her son had worn. Joshua froze. "A bracelet?" he asked. She went on, unaware of his reaction, explaining how her son had a small burn scar on his finger, a little mark a mother never forgets. It hit him like a punch in the gut. He had that same scar, and he'd kept since childhood a silver bracelet with the exact same engraving. It couldn't be a coincidence. His head spun as she spoke of 30 years of searching without a clue, not knowing if her son was alive. That's when Joshua found the courage. He opened his wallet, pulled out a small package hidden in a leather lining, and carefully unwrapped it. There it was, the bracelet. When she saw it, time seemed to stand still. Mrs. Aurelia covered her mouth, tears welled in her eyes. She touched the bracelet with trembling fingers as if it was sacred glass. It was identical, the scar, the bracelet, their ages, the orphanage. Joshua told her he'd never known his origins. He'd been adopted at 6, but before that, he'd spent time in a shelter he barely remembered. No name, no leads, nothing. Just that bracelet, kept without knowing why. Between them, a question formed that neither dared speak aloud. What if he really was her lost son? The possibility was too overwhelming to ignore. So they decided to get tested. No impulse, but necessity. They needed answers. The next days passed in quiet anxiety. Joshua and Mrs. Aurelia went about their routines, but inside they waited. The test was done discreetly. Samples collected, protocol followed. The lab promised results in 48 hours. That night, Joshua stared at the bracelet for almost an hour, wondering how life could have closed this circle. A woman who lost her son, a boy with no past, the same symbol, the same scar. Too many coincidences. Coincidences that couldn't be anything but fate. Mrs. Aurelia didn't say much, but her eyes shone a little brighter, as if, for the first time in decades, she allowed herself to hope. On the third day, the email arrived. Joshua opened it alone. He read it, reread it, and then fell silent. Mrs. Aurelia was sitting at the kitchen table, folding a dish towel, when he came in. He didn't have to ask. He saw in his reflection that something had broken. The result was negative. They weren't mother and son, not by blood. She didn't cry right away, she just lowered her head and closed her eyes. A long sigh escaped her lips, the kind of sigh only someone who's lost before knows. The silence between them was heavier than any words. Joshua felt his throat tighten, but managed to say, "I'm sorry." She looked at him, voice trembling, but steady. "You don't have to apologize for not being my son. I should thank you for reminding me I could still hope." A pause, then she added, "If it's not by blood, can it be by heart?" He knelt beside her and nodded, firmly. From that day on, Mrs. Aurelia never carried her bag alone again. Joshua bought her medicine, repaired her little house, installed a heater and a fan, got her a new mattress. He did what nobody had done for her in 30 years, and for the first time in a long time, she slept without back pain and woke up to hot coffee on the table. Outside, the world rushed on, but inside that home, two strangers found what they needed most: care. Joshua thought that was where it ended. The test had come back negative. The past, it seemed, couldn't be rewritten. But something inside him refused to accept that answer, not out of stubbornness nor pride, but because the story still had too many gaps. He began investigating on his own. He went back to the orphanage where he'd grown up. The place was still there, its walls faded and its halls heavy with silence. He spoke with an old staff member, Mrs. Lucia, who remembered him vaguely. "You were one of 2 boys who arrived after that fire in the countryside, remember?" Joshua froze. 2, she confirmed. Years ago, 2 boys had been brought there from a small village that had burned down. Their paperwork got mixed up. One arrived without a name, the other with a wrong tag. It was a mess. One of them, the fairer-looking boy, was quickly adopted by a wealthy family in the city. The other stayed behind, stayed for months, until he vanished from the records, as if forgotten entirely. Joshua's heart raced, that was it. The DNA test could be right. He wasn't Mrs. Aurelia's son, but maybe that other boy was. He asked for the old files, searched every name, every clue. He found one, Leandro. That was all he had, a name, a sloppy record. But it came with an address for a shelter Leandro had stayed at years later. Hope rekindled, but in a new way. Now it wasn't about him discovering who he was. It was about giving Mrs. Aurelia the answers she'd spent her life chasing. Joshua left the orphanage with a crumpled sheet of paper in his pocket and a clear goal: find Leandro, and maybe finally give Mrs. Aurelia the closure she'd waited a lifetime for. All he had was the name, Leandro, and an old, barely legible address of a long-shuttered shelter. He pursued it anyway. He made calls, combed public records, sifted through donation lists and old social media profiles. Days passed in silence. He told Mrs. Aurelia nothing. He didn't want to raise false hope until he found him, a registration with an NGO supporting adults who'd aged out of foster care. Leandro da Silva, age matched, last known location, North Side. His heart pounded. He called the number on the file. The voice on the other end was wary, curt. Joshua introduced himself cautiously, said he wasn't selling anything. He just needed to ask one question, just one. Do you happen to still have a silver bracelet? Silence. Too long. When the answer came, it was almost a whisper. Yes. Joshua froze. They arranged to meet at a small, out-of-the-way cafe. Leandro showed up, head bowed, his face marked by a hard life. He looked older than his years, but there was something in his eyes, something familiar. They didn't waste time. Joshua pulled out a photo of Mrs. Aurelia, taken discreetly days before, sunlight catching her weary face on the porch. Leandro didn't need to ask who she was. He was speechless. He stared for a long moment, then reached into the pocket of his worn coat and pulled out the bracelet. It was identical. The same worn silver, the same engraving on the side. The clasp a little bent, its perfect match. Leandro, voice catching, explained he'd had it since the orphanage. No one ever told him what it was, just that it was on his wrist when they found him after the fire, a fire he barely remembered. He never knew where he came from. But now, maybe he knew where he belonged. Joshua felt something he'd never felt before, joy, relief, and a pang of sorrow. Because deep down, he knew the truth. He wasn't the lost son. But maybe Leandro was. He asked if Leandro wanted to meet her. Leandro hesitated, said he wasn't sure. He'd never had a mother. He was afraid to believe and then lose it all again. Joshua simply said, "Maybe she's waited too long for you not to show up now." And for the first time in years, Leandro agreed to take a step towards something he'd never had: family. The sun was just beginning to set when Joshua and Leandro arrived at Mrs. Aurelia's little house. Leandro hadn't said a word since they left. All he held in his hands was that bracelet, closed tight between his fingers. Joshua parked, took a deep breath, and said only, "She's in there." Leandro nodded. Their steps to the gate felt heavy, not from fear of rejection, but from the weight of all those years of waiting. Mrs. Aurelia sat in the chair on the porch. Her body looked even more frail than before. Her eyes cast downward most of the time. Ever since the test result, she'd slipped back into survival mode, grateful for Joshua, but still carrying that ache in her chest. She heard their footsteps. She lifted her gaze and saw them. She froze. Leandro stopped in front of her, unsure what to say. He simply held out his hand. In its palm lay the bracelet. Mrs. Aurelia's eyes went wide. She drew in a shaky breath. Her trembling hand rose slowly to touch his face, then his shoulders, then his eyes. There were no questions, and none were needed. Tears began to roll down her cheeks, not tears of pain, but tears of reunion. Leandro knelt and rested his head in her lap. She wrapped him in her arms as though she meant to protect him from the whole world. Joshua stood quietly, watching the two of them. In that moment, he realized he hadn't lost a mother. He had gained a brother. There, in the middle of an ordinary late afternoon, a woman who had spent her life hoping finally held the child she'd never stopped searching for, and a man who'd never known where he came from had finally come home. The reunion between mother and son lasted just over a month. Time enough to make up 30 years of absence with simple gestures, a cup of coffee and warm bread, a folded blanket at the foot of the bed. The same story told over and over with all the little details only a mother remembers. Every morning, Mrs. Aurelia seemed reborn. With Leandro by her side and Joshua close by, she finally let herself live. But her body, so worn, began to signal its farewell. One morning, Joshua went into the bedroom to call them for coffee. He found Leandro sitting beside her bed, holding his mother's hand. She was gone. Her eyes were closed and a faint smile lingered on her lips, as if she'd finally found rest after a long journey. The grief was quiet. Joshua and Leandro kept vigil together, two men who had been strangers but were now brothers, bound by the love of a woman who never gave up. After the funeral, Joshua found a small letter tucked inside the little box where she kept the bracelet. It was simple, handwritten in her trembling script. "My son, maybe life couldn't give me back what it took, but it gave me more than I ever expected. It no longer mattered to me to know who my real son was. What mattered was that he was good. And I found two. Take care of each other. And if you can, care for those whom no one else sees. With love, Mom." Joshua read the letter aloud to Leandro. Neither of them could hold back their tears. Weeks later, the busy market that once knew only hurry gained a new corner, Doña Aurelia's Corner, a simple spot with wooden benches where seniors and street vendors could eat for free, rest, or get basic medical care. At the entrance, a small plaque read, "Here, no one carries their own bag alone." Joshua also funded a community clinic and began supporting the orphanage where he grew up. Leandro became a volunteer too. He wanted to give back everything he'd found too late. One day, sitting side by side, they watched an elderly woman approach the corner, exhausted and dragging a bag of collard greens. Joshua smiled. "She would have loved this, right?" Leandro nodded. "She made it all worth it." And the two of them, in silence, looked up at the sky, knowing that wherever she was, Mrs. Aurelia was finally at peace. A mother's love doesn't end with loss. It lives on in our deeds, our choices, and the bonds we choose to build. Sometimes, the family life takes away finds its way back to the heart.